That was a particularly tough act to follow, and for no other reason other than I could understand the Irish, but I'm certainly not going to try and speak to you after that lovely Irish that was there in what might come out of my mouth with my Limerick Irish. Look, I'm delighted to be back again, and I really want to thank Joe for the opportunity to speak to you again, because I know just how interesting these debates have been in the past, and indeed I listened into some of the one last night, and I can see that they're again as equally interesting and probably more important almost as we try and rebuild where the country is going into the future. Joe asked me to come along because he figured I might try and be provocative and throw out some sort of, strange ideas at everybody. And I'm going to try and live up to the task, because one of the things that you probably get in terms of training, I've worked in a number of different jobs, but the best job training I ever got was probably as the Sec Gen of the Department of Finance, because that was the training to actually not resile from telling the truths that people need to hear about how we go forward. And that was something that was really important to how we ran the process of the bailout, in terms of not trying to pretend it was rosier than it was, but explain how we were going. And I'm going to probably do a little bit about that again today. I think this is the ultimate irony, this speech, right? Because we're talking about rural Ireland. I'm here in Glenties, and we shouldn't kid ourselves. We are in the middle of a major housing crisis again in this country. We have walked into it blindfolded a second time, despite warnings from 2 and 3 years ago to watch out on this. We have an identity crisis in rural Ireland and an economic crisis in rural Ireland, and we are not going to fix those by just doing more of the same. And it's not going to happen easily. So what does that sort of mean? And as I said, this is a bit of an irony, because I kind of came to probably most people's attention in rural Ireland on this subject when I dared to go to Dublin and tell Dublin that the way to fix Dublin was to spend billions of money outside of Dublin. And they agreed with me, because, as has been said here, the people at Dublin understand that if the rest of Ireland isn't working, that actually the country isn't going to work either. But it works the other way. So the job I have today in Glenties in rural Ireland is actually to say that in order to fix rural Ireland, we also have to invest in our cities. And there are lots of different ways we can do that. And I'm going to try and just throw one of them out there, because, as you know, I'm from Limerick, so of course it's going to be a very Limerick-centric proposal that I'm going to make. But I think it stands up to analysis, and I'm prepared to look at that and argue it backwards and forwards. But there are just a lot more fundamental questions that lead to that analysis that I'm going to try and sort of put out today. I've warned the Minister already I might be doing something like this, so she doesn't come completely surprised in this. But I think we need a completely different way to look at spatial planning. I didn't have a research department like the previous speaker to look through this, so I was trying to flick through the housing document that was issued in the last couple of days, and I don't see anything there about spatial planning. We're building more houses, but we don't necessarily say why and where we're building them. There's a whole load of things that haven't been addressed in that, which follow from, and indeed come before as well, our housing choices. Last night we talked about health services. How and where our people live has a huge bearing on how we try and the cost of delivering health services. And I don't see that in the housing strategy, and I could go on through a lot of this. And for me, the challenge, and the first place that we need to start, is that we need to acknowledge the power of cities across the world, and indeed the power of our own cities, particularly Dublin. And we need to recognise that they don't work at the moment. You talked about the traffic and the time it takes to even get into a small, tiny town, frankly, in the context of global cities, which is Galway. Try doing that in Dublin, it's worse. And we need to get our cities to work first, and that will create the economic resources that we might be able to then use to actually fix some of rural Ireland. Because if we don't do that, if we sort of do this, let's try and put a piece everywhere, we'll end up with nothing working correctly. We'll end up with a country that is operating suboptimally, isn't able to create the resources to actually help communities across the country. And in the 60s, Buchanan in his report pointed out back then that if we do it, what we will be facing is decades of emigration, and we know just how many of those we saw. He says if we get this right, however, we can actually not stop the movement of people necessarily from areas and business models and economic models and living models that aren't suited anymore for the new world. But we can at least make sure that our grandkids and our kids are living a drive away somewhere else in the country rather than a flight or even 2 flights away elsewhere. So you have to start with the cities, and I gave a speech on this in the Dublin Chamber. I'll put this out and I'll give it to Joe, because there's a lot more in this speech than I'm going to be able to go through sort of in detail here. But when I went to Dublin, to the Dublin Chamber, I seemed to ruffle people who didn't understand what I'd actually, or didn't listen correctly to what I'd said about a lot of things about rural Ireland. But I also said that we need to fix Dublin. And fixing the north inner city of Dublin, which is also important for lots of good reasons, is not going to happen with a fund of £1.5 million. It's going to take what Scrap Saturday might call billions and billions, right, to actually get to the core of the issues that we need to do it. We also have a problem in Dublin because we built our city based on really bad, small, regional UK city ideas and a model of suburban living that we've imported from the United States. And these are just not sustainable models going into the future. And so there's kind of a couple of things that are important, right? If you fix Dublin, you cannot do it by doing more of the same. Another important point I would pick up on somebody, no one said a truer word than said, if you love nature and you value nature, then stop living in it. Because you kill it by actually living in it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have the right to choose. And I did have this in my speech before you actually said it to me before I got up here. I'm not saying we should deny people the right to live outside of Dublin. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't force them in making that choice to live particularly in unattractive suburban living across the country, whether it's a small housing estate tagged on to a small village or a small town, or whether it's the large suburban sprawl that we're now developing in places like Naas and in Navan and other towns which haven't been developed and designed to work at that scale. So there are some people who have lived for years in rural Ireland and should continue to be able to choose to live in rural Ireland. But they have to, as was said by the previous speaker, they have to also adapt the way in which they think about what that means, the way in which they operate with a symbiotic relationship with these new regional cities that we might develop along the way. And there's a much more important fundamental point in the context of what we've got up in the back here, right, which is a well-known fact that good cities provide economic opportunities not just for the rich, but for the poorest in society. And that's why fixing our cities in Ireland is the most faithful way to the signatories of the proclamation in 1916, because it's by providing a range of housing opportunities close to opportunities for kids, for jobs and the rest, that we can actually provide the opportunities that we want for the poorer elements of our society, rather than just those rich enough to actually own a house with a garden or even be able to rent a house with a garden around the cities and around our towns. When I made the speech back in 2014, and I'm going to reiterate this point, I was widely criticised for this concept of saying that we should question as a society whether the model of living in Ireland should be 3-bedroom houses with their own private garden. And I'm going to repeat that question, because I don't think that when we think about those models, we think about what it is doing to the rural Ireland we're supposed to cherish so well in the countryside, what it is doing to our environment in terms of the cost from a carbon footprint type of view, and frankly what it is doing to the health of the people that think they are living in a nirvana, but in actual fact, compared to what they could have as lifestyles where they walk to work, where they walk with their kids, they could have a very different lifestyle that doesn't revolve around this thing called a car, which has become so important when you start with the model of people living separated from each other. And people in rural Ireland know better than anyone else that that wasn't the model that we had before. We congregated in towns as much as we could, and we lived in close proximity to each other in communities like we just talked about. And I would suggest that we should start thinking about going back to that, and we have the opportunity to do it in a lot of our urban towns, rural towns, where we create a much more of an urban type carless living for people that want to live in those areas. And what that means across the country is, frankly, we're going to have a population that keeps growing. So, in fact, we're not necessarily talking, although it is happening in places like Donegal, necessarily about depopulation. Because as the country grows, we're going to have more and more people anyway. It's a question of, at least as a first matter, where do we put the incremental growth? Right, so we can split this up into two things. We can take some of the emotion out of it, and we can actually say, where are we going to house and how are we going to house the population growth that we are going to have? Are we just going to simply spread it over the existing pattern, or are we going to encourage it, not necessarily force it, but encourage it into a different model of living than we currently have? And it doesn't work at the moment, because even those that are lucky enough to live near the city centres that we have, and in particular I'm thinking of Dublin, are not living a particularly good lifestyle relative to other cities of its scale. They don't have the same level of social services that they could have. They don't have the freedom to move around the cities in rapid transit, mainly because we have started from a principle of not having enough density in our urban areas. And it's not just me making this up. There are statistics, there are numbers about what the density of an urban area needs in order to support rapid transit and reduce the cost of social services. We know that greater housing will bring down the cost of it. We know deep in our hearts, but we probably like to ignore the fact that the greater the density of housing, the less it costs to supply the housing, and therefore the cheaper it actually is. The less it costs us as a state to give public services to the maximum number of our citizens. Because despite some of the populist rhetoric that we hear, the reality is we don't have an unlimited pot of cash. So we need to use it efficiently. And using it efficiently, take the health service again that we talked about last night, will mean encouraging people to live closer to each other, so we can deliver those services much more cheaply. But encouraging them to live closer is not a matter of, stacking them up on top of each other, as people keep telling me. It's a matter of making that urban type living so attractive that people want to accept it. They want to follow their hearts. They want to follow it. They want to give that type of living to their kids, because it can be incredibly attractive. And I'll come at the end of this, if I get time, to a methodology to sort of try and think about funding that. But we know our old country, we've seen the CSO statistics. It was the first slide I was going to put up. I didn't do the PowerPoint either. I thought I'd save you that. But again, I will give Joe the slides, because I just thought it would be a bit too complicated. We have effectively 5 ways in which we kind of live, if you allow me to sort of just quickly go through them. We have the one that we kind of always talk about in Ireland, the sort of the individual housing along the way, and I won't even need to talk too much about that, because by the time I go to the other 4, you'll know what I think about that, right? Then we have something we might call, and I'm using some terms from a great book by Vishen and Chakrabarti, which is a country of cities, right? We have this ex-urban model, which actually is probably similar to a lot of rural Ireland, right? It's that town where you actually have a housing estate dotted on, or maybe 2 or 3 of them around it. People start moving into bigger 4-bedroom houses on the outskirts of the thing, rather than living downtown. And everybody has a car, because they have to have a car to go and get a pint of milk in the morning. They still have to get into a car to actually go to business. That wasn't how our towns worked before. But we're creating that, and they don't probably work in that town, so they now drive to another town, probably in 2 cars, because both parents are working, right? Now, that's not necessarily a problem in that town itself, but it's a problem when they drive somewhere else, because they add to the congestion of that other town. It's different than what we had in rural Ireland before, because when they went to Castle Island or they went to Roscrea, they typically went to the market there and they contributed to the town. Now, in some respects, the people that are living in our small ex-urban spaces are moving to slightly larger ex-urban spaces, or bigger, and they're causing the traffic problems that we have in Galway. They are killing Galway by their choices. And that's happening because those little ex-urban spaces are incredibly inefficient to deliver public services to. You can't have a bus. The way to get people for 15 minutes from there and into Galway is to put them on a bus and have a bus lane, and to tell the people that want to drive in that bus lane out of it. We're going to keep that for the people that will get and share the public transport and drive with each other, rather than selfishly drive on their own. And we have to take a whole new approach to how we share car usage, how we actually open up the taxi regulations in order to allow that to happen across rural Ireland, to save rural Ireland. The next one up, and I can kind of find ways to make the first one work and work efficiently and be a nice place to live. The next one is the one I hate, which is suburbia. Right? We all grew up, well, probably some of you are too young to remember the Brady Bunch, right? But we all grew up with this idea of suburbia being the nirvana. Thank God we're now thinking that Sex and the City and Friends actually is a different way of living, right? But Bob the Builder always talked about this. I mean, we built an American culture which we watched here in Ireland that encouraged us all out into suburbia. And what happens in suburbia is, again, we have a car. We probably have 2 cars. We can't take the kids to the GA pitch. We can't take them to anywhere without loads of commuting. The bigger the suburban area, the longer we spend in cars, the more obese we get. And these are statistically proven. I'm not making this up. This choice is now currently imposed on an awful lot of people simply because our bigger cities don't work. And they're forced to this lifestyle because it's cheaper in economic terms to buy a house there, but it's a lot more expensive in terms of human living choices as to where we go. The third one that I want to talk about is also the fourth, if you ignore that I skipped over the first one, right? The next model is kind of Dublin. It's urban. But it's an Irish version of urban, which is about 15 sort of, households per acre. It doesn't have the 30 you need for rapid transit. So it clogs up, just like Dublin is doing at the moment. It also has an outdated model of urban living, which is all around a central core. It has an outdated model of actually having suburban places, or should I say places at the edge of the city where you just have jobs. You don't have people living. So everybody's commuting around in their car again because we don't have a better way to actually run it. Which brings me to the new model that I'm recommending for Dublin, which is a much more dense urban space. It's an entirely different model than we have ever seen in Ireland. It has the best public services, funded by the fact that we can actually, by this greater density, create greater wealth and allow that to happen. And when we get that done, then that allows us to do other things. My problem was, as I said in Dublin, is I don't think we have the courage to do that in Dublin. I don't think we know how we can actually increase the density, not just of places like Crumlin and the Liberties, but of Sandymount and Ranelagh and places where the elite of our country currently reside in all too low density again. Right? And so what I recommended was we take another city, one of our regional cities, and we actually start there. And we take all the investment that we need to put into creating that new Irish model, and we create a new urban space that is much more appealing. And actually what will happen is we'll show the people in Dublin what could be, and some of them will decide not to stay in Dublin, and they'll move to this space, which will help to redistribute our population across the country. And I, of course, because I'm from Limerick, recommended that should run from Cork up to Galway, right, with Limerick in the middle, because everything you put in Limerick is an hour away from Cork, from Galway, from Portlaoise, from Tralee and other places. And it changes the centre of gravity of the Irish distribution of population at the moment is somewhere east of Maynooth. Right? That means half of the people in the island are living east of there and half are living west and north and south. Right? We can't leave that as the way I would suggest we want to go forward with Ireland. This isn't new. I mean, I said this in 2014, I said it in 2013, and that's our sort of transition plan as to how we get there. The thing, though, when you think about this then and you start to look at it in terms of why wouldn't we do this, right? We all hear that it's not a good place for kids to live. It's better for them to grow up in the countryside. But do we really mean that? I don't have kids, so I don't know. I'm going to have to defer to people that actually have kids in the audience. But actually, we all remember perhaps idyllic visions of living and growing up as kids in the countryside, but it's not as safe anymore to let your kids cycle around a countryside on their own to school. So we drive them around, right? Where we have a country which now has much more diversity in its city regions than in its country regions, and we know that it's a good idea for kids to grow up in diverse neighbourhoods, to grow up in multicultural and cultured neighbourhoods. And it's easier to do that in bigger urban areas than it is. So these are choices we'll have to make for all of our kids, but I think we need to be fair and not just emotional about how we approach it. Our young adults We bemoan the fact that our young GA players and others are leaving rural Ireland. But actually, statistically, I have the numbers, if you look at it, young adults not only want to move to different places if they can get better jobs, not only because they can relocate for higher pay, but the majority of them surveyed in a DECO survey said they would move just to live in their dream city. That's where their heads are at the moment, and we need to accept that. Then we get to the other spectrum, our ageing communities. We have a fabulous opportunity to solve the problems of isolation, of fear of being broken into, of worrying about falling sick and not having health care, by encouraging our older population. Once the kids have left and they're living in big houses and they've got big maintenance challenges and they have to get somebody to drive them everywhere, to actually encourage them to move back into our small towns, where we can concentrate medical services, where we can concentrate actually the kids that live in that area so that they can actually form these sort of natural symbiotic relationships with younger people and older people all living together again, so they can walk to the pub, they can walk to the coffee shop, they can walk to mass. And we don't do that. I don't know why, but I'm suggesting that. Part of it is we think we don't have any funding for this. Well, like I said about the housing strategy yesterday, which doesn't seem to acknowledge that the more dense you have as neighbourhoods, the cheaper it is to provide social services and public services. We could end up saving an awful lot of money in the way we actually deliver services by adopting some of the ideas I've just said, and use that to create those public amenities, those shared spaces in urban areas that make it just so much more fun to live there, and create these kind of melting pots of economic activity that we need to have. The problem, though, is that we also have suggested in this moving people, potentially, because they want to move, from suburban estates where values have dropped, from rural towns which probably don't work anymore. There's 7,000 less people living in Donegal, unfortunately, after this census. Does that mean that we find a way to relocate another 7,000 people to Donegal? Or do we think about what we need to cut back in terms of services that we offer? Because there are less people, there are less customers using them. Right? So maybe we have to think differently about it. But I haven't quite figured this out, so I only have another minute, so I'm not going to be able to go through it in great detail. But I want to throw out to the smarter people in the room than I the kind of the bones of an idea that we could think about for using for this. Right? And it's sort of based on two concepts. One is the concept that we used to get pubs from rural areas into bigger areas where there were more people that wanted to use them, with a fixed licensing number. The second element of this is a concept that exists in cities like New York, where you not only have a house, you are given the right to build your house higher than it currently is, as a matter of right, by the planning rules. And if you want, you can actually keep your house and sell that extra piece to somebody else, so they can build their building twice as high. And you get a nice mixture in a city like that of different heights rather than everybody going up to 10 stories. Right, so this is a little bit complex, so bear with me. But the idea is essentially that we would take cities, particularly places close to regional areas, and we'd say we want those to be, on average, let's say, 6 stories. They're probably only about 1.5, if even less at the moment, even in Dublin, right, because of the wasted space with private gardens and the rest, and the amount of road space that we have in between. We would statutorily fix that and give it to everybody that lives in that area. So all of a sudden now their house is actually more valuable, but on a certain basis, because not only have they to wonder how big could the planning guys let them build a house, they know it's going to be that, and it can be valued as a fixed matter by a developer who can buy that right off of them. Right? We can actually extend that, because we can say we'd prefer to some of the people in areas which aren't dense to move as well, and we give them a portion of that extra space, which means that their houses in areas where we don't really want to have houses are now actually more valuable, and they're encouraged to sell them. And with the extra money, they don't have to move out to the suburbs, they don't have to move to other areas, they can actually buy something in that new development or indeed negotiate that in as part of the way of doing it. And with that, we could free up public realm in our cities, we could increase the density, and we could, I think, move to some of the earlier stuff I mentioned about cities. Now, what does that mean for people in Glenties? Here's where it gets a bit more dramatic and provocative. We could actually give people living in rural Ireland some of that too. We could decide that as a policy matter, it doesn't cost us anything, right? Because it's already going to be in some developer's pocket or some house owner in Dublin already under our current system. We could actually say that we've decided that there's been a population projection, let's say, I'm not going to pick on Donegal, let's pick on Kerry, right? In Kerry, where it's going to reduce. It's gone already from 300,000 down to 150,000. We don't want to have some of the houses that are currently in the stock. So we'll make it incredibly attractive for those people to cede those houses to the state by giving them the right to sell that house via the state effectively to the developer who builds in our bigger city in Limerick or in Dublin. And that person now has a wad of cash that they can take to move into the town nearby. Anybody who lives in a declining rural area is effectively able to sell their property at the value of a successful part of the state and use those funds to actually move to a different place to live. And it helps to create a funding mechanism, and indeed I suggest if you do it with time zones and actually on a national basis, probably would overcome an awful lot of the objections we have to people wanting to move, because they're now able financially to do it, and by fixing the urban places to which they go, you actually create an incentive for them to do that as well. So on that basis, I'm going to leave your minds now spin with what that might mean. I'm not going to ask the Minister, because it's very unfair, because I didn't tell her about this idea, to try and respond to something like that as an idea. But I think deep down there is a core of an idea that we could actually develop that would allow us ultimately to do what I want to do, which is to transform the way in which our country operates, and in doing so, to open up the maximum opportunities for all of our citizens and all of our communities. Thank you very much for your attention.